Welcome to this week's Sort of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. The second one is we're going to be going over the release of the EU Parliament's Armenia report by its Foreign Relations Committee. And lastly, we'll be covering the massive earthquake that struck the countries of Syria and Turkey about 10 days ago. Let's start off with the first topic of the week, which is the illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. What we have had this week is obviously a worsening situation because we're past day 60 of this illegal blockade. We're having greater and greater shortages. In fact, more things are being added to the rations coupons list that you need to buy because there's obviously less and less items every day that goes by. As concerningly, almost the entirety of this week, the gas to Artsakh has been shut off by the Aliyev regime with sort of very short spurts in which they opened up for 6 hours, 12 hours, sort of like psychological torture for people living there. But for the most part, the entire region has been cut off with gas, which has actually obviously interrupted school, work, and many other different activities. There's a couple of things that I think of note that people are missing and that hasn't been commented on. This is one of the reasons that this region has actually been able to survive intact under these situations that are broken other people. Is this great social solidarity that exists, that if people are coming together to fight against this fascist blockade. But on a concerning note, I think what we're really seeing here is the normalization of criminality, as I call it. Here you have, in essence, a criminalized regime in Baku that is holding 120,000 people hostage, cutting them off from the world, from food, from gas, and half a dozen different things, and there's really nothing going on to stop them from doing so. The Russian state talks about that they're mediating, but as far as we know, there are no talks going on. As far as the West is concerned, yes, there have been a lot of strong statements, but frankly, unless those strong statements are backed by actions, nothing is going to change. In fact, I would say, unless you're acting, you're just as complicit as the regime in Baku or their allies in Moscow that are essentially blockading and trying to starve 120,000 Armenians to death. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, and we're going to discuss this very interesting report that came out of the EU Parliament about, they call it a country report about Armenia. This was passed by the committee at a 55-0 vote, so there was almost no opposition. There was 5 people that didn't vote, but obviously this is strong support across the board. If you actually read through the document, this is actually remarkable in what it says about Armenia, and I think our diplomatic team actually deserves a lot of credit for it. What the report highlighted that directly called for Aliyev's occupation armies to leave the parts of Armenia that it's illegally occupying, demanded that the illegal blockade of Artsakh come to an end, called for a lasting peace agreement, and most importantly, that guarantees the rights and securities of the Armenians of Artsakh in very clear terms, something that the EU leadership has not done, but the parliament is doing. It went on to call Armenia a leader in democracy, and there's a bit of a context here because for almost a decade and a half, the favorite child of this region has been Georgia, as far as the EU is concerned, and I think this language is just as pointed at the regime and the government in Georgia as moving away from a democratic system as it is praising Armenia. So I think it's just putting us as us slowly becoming the favorite child of the European Union when it comes to that project is concerned. Now, what does all of this mean? Frankly, in the short term, for our immediate needs, it's not particularly relevant, but diplomacy and politics is actually a long-term game. And what we're really seeing here is the slow cracking of the other side's narrative and a new narrative that is building about this country. And also, first and foremost, showing that there's distinct breaks between the EU leadership, which is actually quite hostile to Armenia and pro-Baku, and the European Parliament that is becoming more and more pro-Armenian. So let's go through what the narrative, the very successful narrative that the regime in Baku has sort of weaved about Armenia in the EU for many, many years. One of them is that we're a puppet state of Russia, allied with that country. That we're a strategic ally of Iran, that we're a corrupt country just like their own, and that we're an undemocratic country just like their own, which is obviously none of these things are true. Modern politics, above all else, is about positive, which is weaving these positive narratives, advancing your strategic alliances, and how your country is perceived, while at the same time disarming and dividing your enemies. What this shows is that what we are doing, or slowly starting to do, is to break out of our isolation and to tell a narrative about this country, which is actually one that is true and accurate, which is that this country is an island of freedom in the sea of tyranny when it comes to politics and personal rights, while we have a growing economy, especially in the IT sector, that is entirely becoming integrated into the world. Now, just as importantly as you weave a new narrative about yourself, is really about weaving a narrative about your primary opponent. In this case, what we need to be highlighting in the context of the West, especially the EU in this case, is what is reality, which is the Baku-Moscow axis that is lined up against Armenia and the West. And we saw an example of it this week when both speakers from their supposed parliaments met, and they spent all their time attacking Armenia's Western and democratic moves. This is key in weaving this narrative about this authoritarian relationship that's lined up against us, and by slowly cornering them into the corner, making them have far and less options in what they can do against us in the context of the European Union. Let's move on to our last topic of the week, which is the massive earthquake that struck Syria and Turkey about 10 days ago. This was a series of actually two quakes that hit about 10 hours apart. The area impacted is almost 200 kilometers long. In truth, the areas, this earthquake is actually far worse than it is being reported, especially when you get out of the main towns and go to small villages where there's entire towns that have been leveled. The response, for the most part, has been very poor in both places, but in reality, given the scale of what has hit these countries, almost any state would have difficulty dealing with it. The world response, frankly, has been overwhelming, mostly in the case of Turkey and very little in the case of Syria. Armenia itself has sent aid both to Turkey and Syria and rescue teams to both of these countries. What this means, I think they're actually doing the right thing. I know the obvious case to be made is while the Turkish regime is, supporting, the only country in the world that's supporting the illegal blockade of Artsakh, why are we sending them aid? Because ultimately, frankly, this isn't about them. It is about us and our perceptions in the world. So I think they have taken the right steps in that direction. What is sad to see here, and I'm very glad that we're actually doing things in Syria. There have been multiple planes with supplies that are from Armenia that have flown there, is how little aid Syria is getting for very distinct political reasons, which I think are uncalled for. All of those sanctions, frankly, need to be lifted, at least in the short run, to help with recovery efforts in that country. Now let's move on to the response of the Turkish state. From what we're hearing, what we're seeing, at least initially, the response was far slower in areas that are essentially full of minorities, whether they're Kurds, Alevis, or Arabs. And we saw this mostly in Hatay also, where they're the greatest areas that are neglected by the Turkish state. Same thing can be said about cities or areas that are run by opposition party and opposition to Erdogan's regime. There have been reports of looting across the affected areas. We don't really know if this is simply desperate people looting for food or water, or criminal gangs, or possibly both. What's interesting is in social media, which sort of gives you a sense of the underlying values or opinions of the society, there's been massive conspiracies, stories about how this earthquake was actually caused by high-frequency waves launched by a U.S. aircraft carrier. I know it sounds ridiculous, but this growing anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism actually has a history going back almost 10 years in that country, and this is a very good example of it, and this is from the Turkish Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu.
Amerikan Büyükelçisi'ne buradan söylüyorum. Hangi gazetecilere yazı yazdırdığını biliyorum. Pis ellerini Türkiye'nin üzerinden çek. Çok net. Pis ellerini Türkiye'nin üzerinden çek.
As far as the response for Erdogan himself, he's made one big speech to the country after the earthquake.
Bu tarihi felaketin üstesinden gelmeye çalışırken yalan haberler ve çarpıtmalarla insanımızı birbirine düşürmeye niyetlenenleri yakından takip ediyoruz. Gün onlarla tartışma günü değildir. Günü geldiğinde şu anda tuttuğumuz defteri de açacağız.
So instead of using this opportunity to unite the country, he's actually using it as a political ledger to divide it. With the elections coming up, it's not hard to imagine that all of this is not going to end well. In conclusion, there's actually a history of authoritarian states not responding well or properly to both man-made and natural disasters, which have had distinct political implications that have, in many cases, brought these regimes down from power. And we saw this in the Soviet Union in the 1986 Chernobyl case, or 1988 Gumri Spitak earthquake, and there's been other examples. Most recent one actually in Turkey in 1999. Ironically, this is how Erdogan and his party came to power, is after the 99 earthquake. So this is going to have distinct political implications, and obviously this will be driven by the economic hole that this event is going to put the country in for the next 10 or 15 years, because obviously Turkey is not Japan or Germany or the United States, and it's not easy to recover from such things quickly. So most likely Mr. Erdogan has to go borrow money from places like the IMF and the World Bank, which comes with its own restrictions and something that will limit his political play in the region. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.